Uh, I guess it's an awkward moment. I'll have to start it, and excuse me, I'm almost inviting myself onto the stage. But thank you very much, Medha, for announcing everything. When you were there, I was also a bundle of nerves. Seeing so many people, like I said, is a big responsibility, and I'm very grateful to Professor Kumar and Dr. Sinha for giving me a warm welcome and a lot of encouragement. And I hope not just the book, but other future works by all scholars, not just in this discipline, but in the larger arena of humanities and liberal arts, matures. And I feel very grateful to be part of the JGU community. Thank you very much. And now I am ready to face your questions, all of yours.
Well, I don't really have a question yet, but I must say that when Mr. Murthy referred to the experts on the panel, I thought that was a little ominous, because I happen to be the critic who Arup ensnared into this panel discussion, because I was the one who wrote the first review of his book. And the next thing I know is, which I happen to have come across, someone else sent me another railway book to review, and then I'd come across this one, and I thought, why not review both? And then he got a good review, the other one got a bad review. And the next thing I know, there was an email from Arup saying, oh, I'm having this launch, would you come and participate in the panel? So I'm the critic rather than the expert. But I must say that what struck me most about the book was the very fact that it opened up the idea of the railways as having very many personalities, which not necessarily most books that have tackled the subject have made an effort to do. On the one hand, are the railways as one of the distinguished earlier guests said, something that sort of sucked out a lot of economic resources from India. But on the other hand, when you think of it, it often contributed to creating a sense of Indianness. There's one scholar who's talked about how the distance or the time it took to go from Calcutta to the Puri temple was reduced from 26 days to 12 hours, with the result that suddenly there was this burst of enthusiasm for ritual, burst of enthusiasm for temple going. And all of that generated a Hindu consciousness in which you can see the roots of present-day Hindutva even. So did railways contribute that as much as they contributed or took away economic resources? One of the most fascinating things I thought was when you refer to the railways as clandestine spaces for vegetarian-looking Indian businessmen to taste beef. And I thought that was a wonderful way of putting it. I think it was a quote. Yeah, I thought it was a wonderful way of putting it, because think of it that, suddenly there was a secular space, so to speak, that was moving. It was neither here nor there. It was on tracks, going from one place to the other. You could be anybody there. It's like the boat Brahmins who went out to Trinidad and Tobago. When you enter the boat, you're one caste. When you get off there, you become a Brahmin. It's a little bit like that. You're on the train, you could do anything you wanted. And because nobody was there to judge you, it was modernity on wheels and modernity for you to go and occupy. So, it was a fascinating read altogether, and I enjoyed it very much. But
yeah, that makes me think of, since you're talking about it as a secular space, I'm just thinking also in a certain sense that, say, you compare it to other modes of transport, like whether it's air or car, whatever, they're much more, they're smaller and they're kind of don't encapsulate as much. They don't have, not as evocative. But as a result, I'm also thinking the train do have very much sort of capture a class, because there is a first class, there's a second class, there's, you've also spoken about the first class trains and the air conditioning, and all these also leads to a lot of, and again, you start with Gandhi and the way he was thrown out of the train. So it was definitely a caste barrier too, and that's how it started. So do you think that barrier has been overthrown, or is it still existing in certain ways? Because you do still have, all of that. It's not caste possibly, but more class.
That also allows me to speak partly about what was the scene in the 1850s and 60s in the Indian Railways. Now, there was a lot of debate in the British Parliament whether the Indian Railways would be a successful venture or not, because it was an industry, like I said, not a state-owned one, but a private enterprise, for which the Indians were supposed to be paying the fares, and when there were taxes, they were supposed to be paying taxes as well. So it was an Indian-funded East India Company enterprise. Anyhow, there was a lot of debate in the British Parliament that Indians will not be using the railways because they are barbaric or they do not know the benefits of civilization. But they were proven wrong. And in the 1860s and 70s, whatever European narratives we have, even from the best of them, you see, the gentlemen, the two gentlemen that is, who came from Europe did manage to have a streak of racism in them as well. So after saying lots of good things about India and the geography and the vegetation and the industry here, they definitely had to say something nonsensical about the passengers themselves. And the way the passengers was described was definitely not ingratiating. So they were very horrified, to say the least, at the fact that the Indians are also traveling by the trains, despite them traveling third class, despite the fact that they're traveling in almost inhuman conditions at 45 degrees centigrade. The Europeans were very unpleasantly shocked because of two things. A, of course, that the Indians are taking the railways, whereas it was debated that they will not. And B, because they are doing it more comfortably than the Europeans themselves. Now, this brings us to the idea of class consciousness and class segregation. I believe there are a few things that Gandhi understood very well that we do not discuss even now openly. Recently, a publication, asked me to focus more on the fact that whether or not the transient families that we used to build in the railways of 1 or 2 days long are declining or not. We have, as an emotional, as probably an affectionate nation, which we are, I believe, this tendency of thinking that we create bonds in the railways and we are able to overcome many of our distinctions, arbitrary distinctions of class, gender, and caste. Perhaps a very small population of India is able to do that even today. Perhaps we are not able to overcome these distinctions. And therefore, we are quite sentimental about these transient families, which we do form in the railways. But very often, many of us, I think are still resistant to the idea of mingling. And I am not really hoping for a total emotional transformation, people falling in love and making families and several other projects on the railways. But all I mean to suggest is an element of intermingling, not to share your food, not to share your seat, but simply a kind of recognition that somebody else is also there. And that used to perhaps happen when the first class cabins were coupes, when they used to be closed identities. Nowadays they are sort of open, but there is even more segregation, ironically. I think India is yet to go a much, much longer way. And recently there has been some criticism that there's been a fare hike and so on. Probably the problem is not the economic inflation alone. The problem is more in the cultural, segregation which we have grown up with. And while for people like Kipling and Twain, the trains were an activity of seeing people, of a diversity of people, for us, unfortunately, it has been an experience of, observing nature, geography, scenery, and all those things, but also taking lots of services, lots of entitlements. So yes, I do believe we as passengers would like to cultivate in our future generations, these responsibilities of sharing and caring and interdwelling, but somewhere or the other, that elitist sense of entitlement remains somewhere. I would like to confess that I feel very sad that the ashtrays have gone away from the Indian Railways. This is not due to any other fact, but purely because they were an interesting artifact to look at. You see, somewhere that nostalgia is also rooted in some kind of entitlement of being serviced, by a person or an artifact or a commodity exactly where you are, not having to go somewhere else to the restaurant car or to some other room, to the, maybe to the washroom and so on. Earlier, if you know, there used to be attached washrooms to first class cabins as well. So with with time, more and more of these amenities will keep going away, and more will start arriving with the new Tejas Express. Now we have amenities that we have on airplanes usually. So maybe the whole geography of trains are changing, and the architectures are changing, and maybe the entitlements are also changing.
Taking off from that, let's talk about the relationship between the colonizer and the colonized. You've talked about the labor of nostalgia, which is the entitlement you're talking about, and the labor of wretchedness, which also you've dwelt upon, of 1,700 people dead per mile, etc. And so there are these two parallelly very strong narratives, both of which are reclaimed parallelly as well, which you've done in the book. And it's very interesting to see that in 18th century there's a lot of fiction that talks about the mingling of the Europeans and the Indians and their children born out of that wedlock, and possibilities are explored. In the 19th century it vanishes, reappears with E.M. Foster in 1926. But in Steele, who you've mentioned, and a book and a story you've mentioned, there is an Englishman and a native man who's a saint. And they both die on the railway track together, and they're inseparable because they've been crushed by the railway. And they're buried together in the desert. So this is a strange kind of a prophecy of a doom, as well as a climation of some kind of a hybridity as well. And so is this what, in a Derridian sense, what has come to haunt us back? The dead people while building the railways, culminating in the partition, and which is why what you're calling a stereotype or romance, but is that what haunts us? So it's two parts to the question. So,
just for the benefit of the people from other disciplines who very kindly come here. This is a very important question. I do talk about something called ontology in my book, although I do not stress very much on it, because I like what Mr. Sinha said. I've tried not to be an academic in this book. It's written as more of a non-fictional effort. However, I do discuss a few philosophical or theoretical examples, one of which is ontology, which Amit is sort of referring to. And ontology, of course, like I mentioned, the nostalgia that we have for artifacts or parallel institutions that grew along with the railway, such as the catering services, such as the dark bungalows. Now, what is a dark bungalow, if you really think about it, is simply a joint for resting, where soldiers or corporates or bureaucrats from the British government would like to halt for a day or two. And there are many railway stories about dark bungalows, there are many ghost stories about dark bungalows, and many food stories, culinary cultures that have burgeoned around the culture of dark bungalows, which we have not just in English but in plenty of other languages in India today, because there are many foods that are associated with the dark bungalows, such as the railway dark, the dark bungalow curry, or the railway lamb curry. Now, there are these parallel institutions which have fostered a sense of nostalgia in us. Either we have experienced it firsthand, or we have received it as a legacy from our previous generations. And we would like to reclaim these vicariously or in practice. We would like to reclaim these while reading a romantic story, a ghost story, and indulge in some guilty pleasures, or we would like to see them in practice. And many of us are guilty of doing this because it's not a crime, really. I believe it's a genuine labor. It takes genuine bit of hard work to be nostalgic, to be informed about history, to aspire to a certain aristocracy. However, please remember, it should take equally as much labor, or you should be able to recognize the labor somebody has actually put into dying to build the railways, or somebody has actually put into staying away from their families while serving you on the railways. So there are these two acts of labor which are both very legitimate. Sorry, I mean to say both equally valid, and we have to talk about both of these things. The way the railways has come to haunt us today is by gradually becoming a declining force in our cultural representations. This is my survey is what the result has been. And I have understood that there are much less films, there are much less literary examples, and there are definitely very few legends that we discuss today with our generations, with our future generations, our previous ones. Usually there is a declining force of traffic in and around the railways. They are no longer part of our legends or our nostalgias anymore. And the way the railways will haunt us, and please, I mean, I really respect all those people who believe strongly, like I do, that we remember the railways each day of our lives. But in practice, honestly speaking, very often the railways are not a practical memory. Very often the railways are not a practical day-to-day enterprise or an industry that we go to. Many of us outside the room do it. Millions of Indians use the railways each day, over 30 million quite easily. But the way we represent the railways has changed. And they have become a very, very brief force from being a proper tour de force in the history of Indian representations of any kind of love, of emotions, of families, and all the narratives which are not about the railways, like Karl Marx said, started featuring the industry called the railways. This is how I believe the railways will come back to haunt us when we start seeing the absence of their presence in literature and in cinema.
But no. I was just going to observe that I was suddenly thinking of one movie, which is the most recent one, which I can think of, which shows the railways in a major way, is Hugo. Yeah. Hugo, right? I mean, Hugo, which Martin Scorsese's, and that's set in a Parisian railway station, but it is nostalgia. So, yeah, otherwise, apart from that, I mean, when it comes to any other cinema, I can't even really think of anything where, as you're saying, it plays a central role. I mean, I'm just elaborating on what you said.
But do you think part of it is because the romance of the railways no longer exists? For example, when the railways first came, it was very new. It was different people from different parts of the country who spoke different languages, dressed in different ways, ate differently, looked different. They're all going up to cities, urban centers. They're all moving towards something. There was a goal. It was the fastest form of communication that existed at the time. And then in the last century or so, especially since in the last 25 years, this communications has become faster. The idea of diversity, especially in India, is no longer such a novelty. When we're used to people being different and that sort of thing. So the railways perhaps no longer serve that purpose of being like this demonstration of Indianness or demonstration of diversity or demonstration of newness. They've become perhaps a sort of aged, ancestor of communications, which we have a certain romance for. But we no longer see as an instrument of the future. The future lies in better technology. The future lies in these bullet trains, which are just essentially like toys. They no longer serve that cultural purpose with which people first approach them. Would you agree? And the other thing is, even the nostalgia for the railways, there's one section in your book with this Anglo-Indian lady lamenting that, in our day there was proper cutlery and silver service and this and that. And now it's all cardboard boxes. Whereas my memory from the railways is loving those cardboard boxes because we look forward to them. I met a Maharani's granddaughter whose nostalgia for railways was, oh yes, they had lovely paintings in the carriage and beautiful rosewood furniture. And I thought, what sort of, these were the palaces on wheels. Maharajas had their own rail coaches. So, in a way, is it because we've given up on the romance of it because it's no longer new? What railways for many generations represented, even till the 1980s when everything was slower in India, do you think the fact that people were moving, everything was a novelty, is what sort of reinforced this nostalgia, this love for the railways, which now that we moved into a faster world no longer appeals to a younger generation?
I wonder if it is politically correct to say that if there's a railway magazine and you are starting out with a new venture, you get the name of your venture in the railway magazine, you will be a success. I don't wish to hurt anyone, but this is practically true. We all would like to do that. I would definitely. The reason is because of the diversity of people that is reading about your venture, like seeing a painting or like using a certain product of hand wash, a certain soap. There used to be the soap packets which were not there just in the airplanes, but also in the Rajdhani and other similar railways. So you used to see that while thousands or millions of others were using it, imagine the simultaneity of the experience that the producer is having while selling his product. Now, therefore, the railways are the fastest mobilizer. There is no doubt about that. They are the fastest mobilizer of an experience in the abstract sense, of technology in a more material sense. I think it would be a bit of generalization to say that today everything is about technology or the fast things. For the last 300 years, everything was about technology. However, probably we are only seeing an exponential growth in the attention deficit that many of us experience about the railways, or any adventure for that matter. The railways were an adventure. We were not only geographically connected from Calcutta to Mughal Sarai to Delhi to Chandigarh to Amritsar or to Ahmedabad, Nagpur and Bombay onwards, but we were also connected chronologically with our grandfathers or previous our predecessors, who used to be able to count the stations mentally, who used to be able to name the stations on their fingers. And probably that activity of a chronological departure from one station and arriving at another station of history is missing today, because we are not orally strong anymore about the railways. We have lost the oral culture about telling the railways to each other. We would like to discuss about the problems we had on the flight, but that is thanks to us. That is not thanks to technology. That is not thanks to any institution such as the state or that particular ministry of aviation, of railways, of any other infrastructural mechanism. But it is largely thanks to us because of the stuff that we are reading, seeing, consuming, and becoming. I would like to add that recently it's been 2 years now, we watched a series called Downton Abbey. I was enthralled by the railways. And it set me wondering, because the Downton Abbey series, much like a film called Manthan, actually begins with the first shot of the railways, also does Sholay. Now, when you introduce the steam engine onto the screen, you are automatically transported. Even if I'm sitting here in Delhi at the India International Center, I show you a slide or a clipping of Sholay, I feel transported to Ramgarh. And so with Downton Abbey, the English, what they did very cleverly was utilize that nostalgia. Their nostalgia for the railways did not necessarily come from the British railways to begin with. It came from the Indian railways. The British were nostalgic because they were away from home and they needed an adventure to relate to, which reminded them of the topography back home, and they created a vast wealth of literature which they were masters at. Nobody can take that away from them. That and the English language and all the other necromantic and plundering acts that they did in India. However, they created that huge volume of adventures and nostalgia which we feel nostalgic about. Probably they will not feel as nostalgic about a railway steam engine when they watch it on Downton Abbey like I do.
To add to that, I think we attach a lot of euphoria to novelty, to technology. Technology proliferates knowledge, but and we're seeing the ramifications and the downsides of social media as well. And having spent time in US and Australia, I can say that railways is something which is very unique to India. These countries, after the Second World War, did not develop their railway networks because there were lobbies, there were car lobbies, and the entire country is run on cars. And the kind of social communitarian bonding that India has had as a unique position is something that needs to be seriously thought about. And if there is a decline in representation, it also needs to be thought about. It's a country which travels so cheap on railways, and if there are people who speak 20 different languages are sitting in this room, somehow you owe it to railways of having traveled from different parts of the country to seek jobs. And at the lower end of the spectrum, the country, I think, stays united because the working class is able to travel from Bihar to Chennai, from Bihar to Himachal, etc., etc. And it's because of this mobility of the working class that railways is such a robust system. So I think it's an overestimation of this euphoria of novelty. What are your thoughts?
I'm sorry, 1 second. I meant when I earlier made my remark that the romance of the railways, in many ways, romance is often created by the upper classes, to use that phraseology. And what, even now, for example, the cessation of the whole railway budget system, for example, the fact that it's now been merged with the general budget. The railways at one point, even for the upper classes, held this sheer majesty. Like the way you were showing those photographs of the railway stations, they look like palaces. It was an impression, it was an establishment of power. It demonstrated authority, demonstrated control. That has gone. The working class definitely still uses it, and there is a point there, which is that most people, I haven't been on a train in 10 years, but there are large numbers of people who can move merely because they're at the railways. But when I refer to the romance being diluted, it is possibly because the upper classes no longer see the railways as an institution of power. They see it as, whatever. We've got other things now.
I totally agree with you. I also completely agree with Amit. See, these are not necessarily contradictory points, and that does come across very clearly in the book, I hope, in the book as well. My book is not an exercise in political history, or economic history, or labor history, but it does reflect on all these three histories to some extent. What I feel is like, and Manu is absolutely right, now, the culture of adventure, romance and nostalgia is definitely an upper class commodity. It is a commodity. And it is people, the so-called working classes, some of us may be a part of that here today, and have nothing to do with that culture, right? And they don't consume that culture, they don't mingle in that culture. At times they are not even welcome in that culture. So they would rather say, we don't use it, we don't want it. There are people not just from, class strata-wise, I'm not really referring to any bracket here, but there are people from diverse walks of life, diverse professions as well, who may not be interested in the so-called culture of adventure and nostalgia about the railways. Therefore, it is left to these people, these supposedly haloed class of people who write and read about the railways, to continue the journey of the railways. And the working classes, they have their own game to play. They are still using the railways, and the railways have only gone up in numbers. So there is no denying the fact that as an industry, as traffic, it is working quite all right. As an industry of representations, however, I believe it is suffering, and we have to hold the reins up.
We don't have storytellers.
Yeah. No, I was thinking of talking about representation again. I'm just thinking of something like Chaiya Chaiya, which is, I think, a song which really encapsulates I suppose, how long ago was that? 15 years or whatever. That shows that working class kind. It's on top of the train that's singing. So yeah, I guess cultural representations also changed along with what you're saying, the changing the way we view literature. The railways.
Although Chaya Chaya is more of a parody of the working class. Liveried people selling vegetables, almost uniforms. It's almost like a parody, but yes, at least it's an attempt to recognize the presence of the working class, or the vegetable sellers, or the tea sellers, and I do believe tea is not just a parallel industry, but actually a representation of the railways. It's very interesting to think of how a commodity becomes a representation of another commodity. And therefore the tea sellers themselves, or the image of the portrait of a tea seller, would be a representation of the railways, because the tea experiment of the railway teapots actually started in the Indian Railways in 1880s and went on to do immensely well, although tea is a crop indigenous to India. We did not know how to drink tea. The nostalgia, I believe, for tea has also shrunken a lot. For fruits and vegetables, which used to be cut and sold on the railways, definitely doesn't exist with as much robustness as it used to. Many families would cook specific things for their railway journeys, I remember. And they would take pains to cook all night. Somebody is making parathas, some specific form of sabzi. And there are specific railway stations along the northern belt, which I have experienced personally. Others might have seen other stations that sell specific kinds of foods. And there are the wheeler stalls in the northern belt as well. So there are these associations, the cultural associations, which we have managed to form, and I think we are also managing to dispossess ourselves of equally well. I guess it's a process. It'll go on. Maybe there would be a new kind of literature, a new kind of cinema, which will try to integrate the nation in with the new and due processes. We have to recognize how India is coming to terms with its own diversity, with the new languages that India is speaking, the new vocabularies of freedom, of democracy, of liberalism, of gender equality, of power structures crumbling down that we are speaking. And we have to see these translated not just in the experiences of our railway journeys, but also the representations of those. I believe, although I'm a railway literature fan, a great fan of cinema, we have managed to create literary examples, classics based on difference. Probably we should start thinking of an alternate form of representation as well, which relies more on inclusion, more on democratic principles as they happen in practice. So much in representation should be the case. And probably then we can move to a new era of a new cultural industry around the railways. So with that, I believe we can all head towards the dinner, which we have been awaiting for a long time. Do you have a...
Yeah.
Okay.
This is about the form of the book. I'm curious about it. Is it that when we talk about 19th century, because we have limited archival resources available, that it generates more nostalgia, more romance, and an age of information overload like now, there's so much of it that we are unable to process it. It's numbing. And so we are unable to process the information of modern history as much as of the 19th century, which I see that there is that struggle in the structure of the book to negotiate between the two paradigms.
Yeah, so I would quote a very renowned scholar. He's currently in the UK, I'm told. It's obviously much harder to go through the drudgery of scholarship if you are living in the 1970s or the 1980s, or if you are looking up materials and archives from the 1880s and the 1890s. And therefore it's much more enjoyable as well because it's rare. The ghost haunts you and you don't find something, and that is what exhilarates you. Today, however, there is more democracy in information. If I would like to, there is parallel projects which I'm engaged in do tend to look into two or three decades of information, and maybe the 1980s and 1990s are not covered, but 2000 onward there is a plethora of information, of newspaper reports, of research material and other kinds of consciousness. But probably the latter becomes less cherishable because it's more easily acquired, and of course less valued because it has less and less antique valuation in its structures. So yes, but I think that only gives us a new challenge and opportunity to create a new body of knowledge, and perhaps not rely on the nostalgic body of knowledge, which of course will have its value, but its value is also going to decline if we do not look forward to a new body of writing. And unfortunately, I have only been able to cover Hindi, English, and Bengali. We need to look into a larger corpus of Indian languages which have covered the Indian railways, and not just languages, not just literatures, not just cinema, but maybe even oral tales, oral songs, and these are bodies of knowledge which probably do not have archival value because no archives exist of these things. But only when we start looking into the oral narratives of the railways, or the partition stories, or the stories of 1857, and there are plenty of oral songs, oral narratives written about the railways which I could not access because many of these were in Bhojpuri or Maithili or Dravidian languages. And if we are able to manage doing that, we are definitely laying our hands on a very, very isolated body of knowledge which will then have its new archival value. So thank you so much. You've been a very, very... Thank you very much. You've been a very kind audience. Thank you, sir. I think we can safely head to dinner, satiate our railway appetites, which is a very, very important part of a railway journey. Thank you so much. See you outside.